So I think we'll get started. So first of all, we just want to thank everyone that's out there joining us today for this virtual closing of Witch Hunt. Before we dive in, we just want to acknowledge the really amazing and unstoppable team at Kunsthal Charlottenborg who miraculously opened this show with us during a global pandemic. So thank you to Michael, Anne, Glue, Desmond, Michelle, Oliver, Matthias, and the entire team. You've been a real dream and a joy to work with, and we would not be here today without you. So thank you all. And we also want to thank the very brilliant and stellar group of artists who participated in this exhibition. Today, we're so thrilled to be joined by nine of these artists who we've thought alongside, collaborated with, and learned from over the last 2+ years. So in order of appearance today, we have Carmen Winant, Vaughn Belle, Youmna Chlala, Aviva Silverman, Sidsel, Meineche, Hansen, and Reba Maybury, Noveta, and Rasmus Myrup. So this exhibition really began with an encounter with a work of art and architecture called the Style Neset Memorial, which commemorates 91 Nordic and Sami women and men who were accused and executed for the crime of witchcraft in 17th century Norway, Denmark. For us, learning about and visiting this artwork really kind of led us into an encounter with an archive. And that's the archive which holds the trial protocols. So these are the records that are containing the language that wrote witchcraft into the law as a crime. And also these records, of course, contain the names of those who committed this crime, those who threatened local power structures and the social and political orders who sought to maintain control. Throughout this process, our dialogues with witchcraft scholars Liv Helene Williamson, Louise Nolholm Callistrop, and Jacqueline von Ghent have given us immense kind of insight and understanding into the brutal specifics of this instance of gendered and Indigenous persecution. And we've also kind of had this unique privilege of accessing and exhibiting Michael Fornitz's incredible collection. These publications and woodcuts depicting witches and sorcerers evoke the threatening carnal female body, instances of weather magic, and they also convey the kind of power of the printing press, a technology of dissemination and an apparatus that really multiplied fear at this point in time. So what does art have to do with it? This is something that Jeppe and I have continued to ask ourselves and each other as we've embarked on this multi-year project. So kind of conveying the textures and contours of historical memory, echoing contemporary violences of misogyny and colonialism, the works in Witch Hunt suggest a need to revisit and interrogate the ghostly murmurs that reside within the bodies, the images, the folklore, and the landscapes that we live within and among. In many ways, we think about this project as a kind of experiment that is very much motivated by art's capacity to form connective threads between seemingly distant or forgotten histories and the present moment. And so on that note, I'm gonna just pass the mic to Jeppe to talk a little bit about how the commissioned artworks kind of came into being and what our process was. And then he'll talk a little bit about the run of show today, and then we'll get started.
Thank you, Alison. And thank you everyone for tuning in wherever you are. Yeah, as Alison said, there were sort of many components to the show, and one central part of it, which is what we'll be kind of entertaining today, is this the aspect of commissioning. So when we embarked upon this process of kind of cross-pollination between historians and artists and historical kind of archives, we sort of embarked on an experimental way of unpacking these areas of interest and see how these ideas could converge and kind of cross-pollinate. An essential component was this commissioning process of inviting artists into this very specific and quite marginal body of research and work with them to develop new work that either responds to the history or offers new lines of interpretation and perspective to contemporary issues that somehow resonate with these bygone histories. So I think for all of us, this was a really experimental process, which has taught us a great deal about what constitutes research in the first place and what constitutes historical knowledge. As Alison says, the history of the Nordic witchcraft trials is really one of absence and gaps in the archive and people and voices who have been forgotten and written out of history in a way. So it's led to interesting reflection on what is the role and agency of artists in the otherwise so coded discipline of history. It's also made us think about how transhistorical reflection is really ripe for artistic treatment because it is so abstract in the first place and often plays out in aesthetics and through aesthetics. And I think just one last note, and this is something we've been asked about a lot and how the show has been received. It's like, it's very clear to note that there is no single witch figure in this project or that have come out of this project. There's not one legitimate form or interpretation or narrative of the Nordic witchcraft trials. And similarly, there's not one feminism, there's not one connection to the present. It's a numerous multiple forms of echoes rather. So this makes for, of course, a much more complex and not a very polemical statement in a time that's like otherwise so characterized by polemicism in media, in art, and politics. And this is manifested in interesting ways in the reception of this project too, which is something we can talk about later. But for today, we have the next 2.5 hours or so of the commissioning artists who will speak about their projects. And they'll present for 10 to 15 minutes on areas of research, process, and the project that materialized. And then we'll have time for brief Q&As following each talk. People are tuning in via Facebook Live, so please leave your questions in the kind of commentary chat section, and we will kind of look at them, and otherwise we will ask questions ourselves. So yeah, without further ado, we are excited to introduce Carmen.
Hi there, excited to be here. Of course, I have to start by thanking you, Alison, Jeppe, for inviting me in on this project, my favorite kind of project, right? To, as you say, to sort of be confronted in the most generous sense by this archive and the sort of research and thinking that you all have been doing. Of course, after our first conversation, I think, Alison, you sent me, like several hundred pages worth of reading that you all had coursed through. So it was just, I felt so sort of lucky to be brought into this and to be invited to make something sort of both in response and also sort of a continuation, of my own creative practice and trajectory. So thank you to you both, and thank you to the Kunsthal, who, as Alison said, worked to install this during the pandemic, and as you'll see with my piece in particular, in some sense, made the piece on site. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to try to keep this to about 10 minutes so that there can be time for some questions, either from you two or from folks in the beyond. Okay. You all can, everybody, I can't see anyone's image anymore, but you all can see this, okay? Can someone give me a verbal yes?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to start really quickly, in fact, by breezing through some past work in a very kind of narrow attempt to, describe and contextualize this project in Witch Hunt. And by that, I mean that I really want to talk about my interest in photography as an object, or the photographic object, as a container, which is to say, and I'll sort of keep moving through slides here, which is to say, not only as an object, but as an object that carries with it its own discrete history, and as something that is porous, really, porous sort of in its meaning, in its multiple meanings, that there can be a kind of course, as we all know, like this sort of the multivalent possibility of the photograph itself, as something that potentially contains within it more than one narrative. And so I'm in that sense a photographer and not a photographer sort of all at once. I'm not even going to sort of qualify these images or describe the particular projects. I just want to sort of move through them to give whoever may be out there kind of a sense of perhaps my sort of unconventional route into and through photography, although I am trained as a photographer. I dispensed at some point about 10 years ago with making my own images and began to think about my practice, not exactly as an archive project or sort of an archive-based practice, but, as perhaps, I still think about myself as a photographer, to be honest. So I still sort of think about myself as an experimental practitioner, somebody who, back up one, as I said, is always thinking about not only like the slipperiness of photographs themselves, but they're sort of their objectified qualities in the world. I love holding photographs. Like I love clipping photographs from books and magazines and printed material, and sort of feeling their surfaces and holding them up to the light, displaying them in double-sided capacities. In other words, like sort of dismantling and exploding where I can this idea of the photograph as a flat frontal illusionistic surface. And I hope that some of these, even though I know I move through them quickly, that some of these examples sort of point to some of the ways in the past that I've done that. I wish I had more pictures of the sort of next phenomenon that I'm about to move into here, because I don't often sort of make pictures of this. It's this thing that in some sense happens in the background, like kind of the actual and proverbial background, which is that in every studio I've ever had, I've used the window space. And I've never necessarily thought of, well, it's sort of slippery, sort of what you think of as work and maybe qualifies work and not work in your studio. But I've always sort of had the idea, even if sort of informally, that the window space was a tool, that there was something happening there, some kind of really basic alchemy that I could use, almost like a tool in the scientist lab, which is not news. Like this is something that my 3 and 4-year-old children do. They hold pictures up to the light, right? There's like this kind of like instinctive impulse, this want for the magic of that, like the most blunt kind of magic that is the double-sidedness of an image. And so sort of, you can see here I'm playing with that in kind of different ways with, this double-sided Katharine Hepburn on the right, to on the left, this was an image of Sharon Tate that I had poked holes through and sort of held up to the window. So just sort of experimenting, with surface light, with sort of, the doubling, in some cases tripling of the image, sort of in service of all of these qualities that I described earlier. So these were just sort of like different iterations of, this is actually when I lived many years ago. I was able to dig up these photos many years ago from when I lived in Boulder, Colorado, and taught at the University of Colorado. So you can sort of vaguely see the mountains in the background. And you can see on the left, even like I was writing with olive oil on paper and holding it up to the light. So my practice does sort of extend into text in different ways, although sort of for all intensive purposes, what I'll be talking about today, and in sort of, the biggest sense, and also sort of across my practice, or like this sort of the hearting, the beating heart of the work is really in the photographic object, this thing that we sort of consider to be so static, how we might sort of continue to unfold it and unfold it. Another one of Katharine Hepburn. So you can see even I'm going to get to the work for that I made for this exhibition in a moment, but I'll just say briefly, like you can see on the left how what was happening on the window there sort of directly transmuted into this work on the right, which was a collage that was sandwiched between two pieces of glass. So if anything, I was sort of thinking about this strategy as a kind of a means to an end rather than an end itself. This is another photograph from my studio when I was at Skowhegan, the residency in Central Maine in 2015, I believe. And you can see I was just sort of covering the walls with photographs that I was finding basically like around, around like roadside and, and like musty old garages and some old bookstores, and it just extended onto the window, right? Like for sort of the same reason that I'm discussing, and also because I needed just as much surface area as I could, as I could get. So here you can see another view, and then sort of one single work on the right. So I'm deliberately putting images on the window. Yes, I need to colonize every inch of space, but also I'm sort of always thinking about the potential twinship of the, sort of that could be of the single image that could sort of be contained within an otherwise perceivable single image. And I might just add to, like, although maybe I'm going too far off in this direction, I think it influenced me retrospectively in ways that I didn't even understand at the time. Like I would observe the way that the light came through the image and then do tests like this of trying to sort of dye the images to achieve the same light quality, of different times of day when the light was coming through the window, and just in a way that is a wildly different affect, from hanging it on a white wall. This image on it's the same image, but the image on the left is an old photograph that I have carried around with me from studio to studio, year after year. I never exhibited it. I sort of flirted with the idea, but I could never quite find the right possibility, and it was, or the right channel or something. And it was, for me, the kind of gateway into this entire project, and sort of point of entry in conversation with Alison, Jeppe. When you all approached me about this idea, and I'm going to sort of get into sort of the more conventional research sort of aspect in a minute, although I do think about this as research too, I immediately thought of this image, which is a single sheet from a Playboy magazine that I ripped out years ago. It's probably from the late 60s, early 70s. And so here you can see sort of like the recto and verso of it, photographed 2 different times, years apart, which is also sort of accounts for the color temperature shifting. And there was some quality about this image in particular, the way that its double-sidedness functioned. Was so sort of elegant and also grotesque, sort of all of these bodies, a kind of quadrupling of bodies, all embracing each other and at the same time sort of being collapsed into one body, I think had a lot to say about sort of not only these qualities about, the discrete photographic object and what could be contained within it, but also sort of outside of that narrative, pointed to, I think, like complex questions of intimacy and desire and, and sort of gendered pleasure. So I began to test. A little bit more, like what could work. I had a lot of images in the studio. Like you'll see the image on the left, this image didn't go in, the image on the right did. And from there, I want to back up and just say, sorry, there's no quite like clean way to talk about this because it's all happening at once. So sequentially, it's a little bit awkward to put it, slide after slide. That I knew that based on our initial conversation that I wanted to return to Silvia Federici, who I imagine many folks out there have read, who was a profound and profoundly seminal influence on me, as a Marxist feminist philosopher. And not that I am that she is that. In particular, I read Caliban and the Witch, I think, shortly after it came out. And it rocked me. There's not enough time to talk about why, all the details of it, but I'll sort of just say across both of these books, and the second book, Witches and Witch Hunting in Women, which is a much sort of slimmer volume that Alison sent me. Across both of these books, Federici is tracking really like the history of the body in the transition to capitalism, and in particular paying attention to the violence against women, what she calls the rebel body, and the ways in which the sort of drive towards, what she'll call capitalist accumulation, not only sort of necessitated, but insisted upon violence upon women's bodies, particularly the rebel body, the body that didn't want to sort of fall in line with the sort of what she would call the reproductive work, the reproductive labor, what's often now called social reproduction, that this work, this unremunerated work that women were being called upon to do so that capitalism could thrive. Okay, this is like a very reductive description, but it blew my world open. And I began to think about, and I just wanted to put in a quick plug. There was this really great, profile of her a few weeks ago in the New York Times Magazine. And I think even better yet, there's a really interesting interview, an in-depth interview with Daniel Denver with her on his podcast, The Dig, for those who are interested. So those sort of two variables in concert, which is to say, like my thinking through the potential of photographic object as something that is sort of not only multivalent in its, sort of, let's say, inherent qualities, right? Like as an object, but, for the way that it can sort of point to, women's bodies, possibilities, agencies, dignities, pleasures, oppressions, that there can be multiple narratives inside of that, was really for me so neatly lined up with the problems that Federici explores across her life's work. And in this project, I realized I could have maybe spent more dedicated time on the project itself instead of leaving it to the end. But in this project, which I was so grateful to get the chance to manifest, I was working to animate ideas of pleasure and sort of redeem, in some sense, the rebel body. Of course, that is an impossible task historically, and also, in terms of visuality. But that was, in some sense, what propelled me, to make these sort of one attempt over and over, and something that could sort of, contain within it a glimmer of possibility, in terms of that redemption and sort of assigning it a kind of representation. So it's a lot to talk about I think this is my last slide, and this is my last slide. It's a lot to talk about in just 10 minutes time, but I hope that conveys sort of some sense of not only my trajectory, sort of leading up to this point, but sort of my research through and beyond. Jeppe and Alison, you can tell me if that was in fact what just happened across these last 10 minutes.
That was beautiful, Carmen. Thank you so much. And thank you for having all the images lined up in this way. Because I think, as you say, the images and the quality of the image are so really essential to this project. And I love the way you talk about the accumulation of imagery and kind of establishing an archive of extremely ambivalent kind of images. And that has certainly been the kind of response to them in the exhibition space, that they're both extremely beautiful and aesthetic, but at the same time, suggest pain or suggest a kind of suffering or a kind of violence. I don't know, Alison, if you have a specific question or if you want me to pose one.
Well, I guess I'm interested in hearing, more about like the source material, Carmen. I know you have this kind of ever-growing archive, and so throughout our dialogue, we got like PDFs of things that you were thinking about and experimenting with. And so just in terms of the kind of aesthetic strategies that are happening here, I'm curious just to hear you, speak to how you make those decisions and how you work with this kind of trove of images, and where some of these images come from, and I guess also thinking about what it means to kind of recontextualize them within a show like this and an institutional space.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's such a different sort of point of entry than, say, another project like mine, like my birth at MoMA, which was so content driven, right? There was such a sort of specific narrative, a kind of picture that I was looking for that represented a dedicated experience. You know, even if those sort of experiences ranged, it was quite sort of recognizable. This was in some sense like the inverse process, and that I had to ask myself, like, what is a picture of a rebel body? You know, like, what is a picture of a woman sort of, you know, let's say like redeeming her own agency, you know, from like, you know, like a hegemonic state or something. It was like, where do I begin with that? And again, as I mentioned, like the impossibility of that assignment was what was so compelling for me. Like I knew that there was no picture of that, but I sort of hoped in some that there would, you know, be a kind of affect, which, you know, I think there is. So, you know, the books range quite a lot. Like for instance, this image of the moon, which recurs a few times throughout, this sort of blue moon, which we can see 3 from the left here, is from a book about like moon goddesses and fertility. You know, many of the books in some sense are feminist, maybe not if like capital F feminist, but, you know, they're coming from sources, you know, that are sort of, yeah, pieces of printed matter that are like disseminated by and for women. So in that sense, there's not like so much daylight between like the source material, you know, and its aims and sort of where it's ending up and sort of my ends. But yeah, there's quite a range. There's an image of, you know, maybe 5, 6 in from the left, of a woman, a black and white image of a woman demonstrating Tai Chi methods. And that's a book, again, by women, for women. You know, so there was no mandate that like it has to be this kind of source material. But, you know, I am really sort of interested in in this sort of problem and possibility of feminist literature and the idea even of a feminist photograph. Like, what is that? You know, and do women in fact see and frame images differently? So those books are already coming into my studio, and it would often be the case, and I've talked to you too about this, that I might be sort of researching for another piece, and, you know, your commission would always be, you know, kind of front of mind. And I would always be like, as soon as I would find an image, I would turn it over, right? So like there was this sort of impulse inside of me that fanned out across whatever number of projects that I was working on. And I think that was to my advantage and to the advantage of the project, that it wasn't all coming from sort of one source, and that they're quite diverse. I mean, there's a book of medical, sort of a diagnostic medical book. There is, you can sort of see in the middle here, this is that Playboy image that I described that like sort of finally found a home. So, you know, there's books on like biracial love. So it's quite diverse, and so it should be, I think.
Thank you so much, Carmen. And the notion of the status of images, where images come from, this is something Alison touched upon briefly in the introduction, that, you know, the invention of the image, of the print press is really something that became a very big theme in the show. And it's something that I think Sidsel and Reba will also touch upon later, but certainly something that was also kind of introduced to us by way of your work. So we thank you for that. Thank you so much for
thank you for having
us.
me across the board.
And yeah, we'll move on to Vaughn Belle, who is joining us from the US Virgin Islands. Is she here?
I
yes,
am.
yeah, okay.
How are you?
Good. How are you, Vaughn?
Good, thanks. Good, thanks for putting this together, inviting me.
Thank you so much for being here. Yeah, go take it away. We'll be listening.
All right. All right, just double checking. Everyone can see everything okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'll just start off by giving a brief intro to my practice in general. I like to say that I make visible the unremembered, and that I see my practice as kind of an investigative tool, a way to engage in dialogue, a platform for thinking, and a way to develop knowledge. And because of this, I work in multiple disciplines. I work in painting, video, installation, photography, writing, video, and public art. And over the last 10 years, my work has centered on the material culture of coloniality, presenting counter visualities, narratives, and counter archives. I am from the Virgin Islands, a place that has changed colonial hands 7 times, but the longest being Denmark for over 250 years. And in 1917 was sold to the United States. And during that transfer process that happened a little over 100 years ago, a lot of the archives and records were taken from the Virgin Islands. And so we've been a people who've had to remember and develop our collective memory without our records. And so in doing that, we tend to focus on song, dance, ritual, and other oral traditions. And so my work has often been about creating, researching those traditions, thinking about these alternative archives, exposing the silences in the colonial ones through developing my own imaginary, and also through embodying some of the archives. So I wanted to just give a little example and context to my work. I'll just show a few projects. This one is called Cheney, and it's thinking about these small shards of colonial pottery that come out of the colonial period that keep resurfacing. And in this, I create these large scale oil paintings, piecing together these different fragments. Here's another project called the Planter's Chair, which is this antique chair, this ultimate power chair that was created where the planter would sit and a servant would probably take off his boots. And in this exhibition, I had various people literally kind of embody that chair and thinking about embodying that history by taking these Polaroid portraits. And here's another project called Wall Rubbings, which is thinking about these coral stones. A lot of the foundations in the buildings in the Virgin Islands are made either by the Danish brick, which you see the yellow brick on the right, or the coral stones that were culled from the ocean by the enslaved Africans. And so this is a project where I'm literally making a wall rubbing and thinking about creating a piece that's making a marker and a record. So one of the things that I think I found really interesting in thinking through this piece is, of course, it's dealing with a period that is a little bit before the Danish colonial period in the Virgin Islands, but it extends into it. And as I was thinking about, when I say extends into it, I mean, a lot of the persecutions that happened with the witches in Scandinavia, there was similar persecutions happening to people in the former Danish West Indies that practice African spiritual beliefs. And so in the slave code laws, you see that there are lots of people who are being punished, imprisoned, being brought to trial for practicing a lot of their beliefs, which could have included like venerating ancestors or different divination and magical and religious practices. And so although I can't read those court trial records because they're in Danish, I was able to kind of look through the research of other Danish scholars. But I wanted to show this image because this was the first image that I really thought, okay, I think I want to deal with this idea of persecution. And this is a picture of a baobab tree. It's a tree that would originally have been brought from Africa. There are lots of myths around how they end up in the Caribbean, but pretty much people say that people brought them in their hair or in their clothing during the Middle Passage. And so when you see these trees in the Caribbean, it's a very powerful and symbolic image of that connection. But here in St. Croix, there was this mythology around this tree that there were a little over a dozen women that were burned during the fire burn, which is the largest labor revolt in Danish colonial history that happened in 1878, which the monument project that I worked on with Jeanette Ehlers, I Am Queen Mary, it takes as a point of departure that historical event and Queen Mary as a leader of that event. So here there's this mythology around these women that were burnt at this tree. And I had actually never been there. So in doing the research for this project and just kind of thinking about what I wanted to do, I went there for the first time. And it seems kind of, it's a very mystical tree, but I just couldn't imagine how women were hung from a tree and burnt here. On the right image, you'll see that there's a plaque there that kind of talks about this oral myth, this legend that is now concretized in a plaque. And it just made me think a lot about these kind of contrasting histories. I think a lot of times when you think about archives, you think about the worship of the document. And so I feel like this was almost a way of Virgin Islanders trying to take this mythology, even though I actually don't think there's a lot of historical basis for the truth of it. What I thought was most interesting was the way that we tried to concretize oral traditions by using some of these same aesthetics of monuments. Like it was almost like kind of monumentalizing this oral tradition by putting it into a plaque. And it just made me think a lot about of how history archives, monumentality of them. And I had also read this book by Maurice Condé, who I think she's from one of the islands in the French Caribbean. I think it's Martinique, maybe Guadeloupe. But she wrote a book in the 1990s called I, Tituba, Black Witch of Salem. And I thought that was interesting because Tituba supposedly came from the island of Barbados. And so I thought this might be an interesting way of also maybe connecting the Caribbean into this history with the Salem witch trials in the United States. But what I found most interesting when I read that book was how Tituba is the first witch or the first woman that is labeled a witch, the first person who's arrested, but she kind of saves her life through spinning tales and kind of using the hysteria of the town and throwing it back at them, which I found so interesting how she used the power of inversion and storytelling to kind of save her life. So she was like, oh, when they would ask her about more women, she would just give them all kind of inventive stories and just keep going and then say things like, well, well, now the devil has bound my tongue, so I can't give you any more, but maybe next week I can. And she just kind of stalled it out until she eventually was released. And I found that really interesting in the inversion. So when I was thinking about the court trial records of the people in the Danish West Indies who were brought to trial for practicing what was deemed as witchcraft, or obia, which is the word that was used, when you see people say that they were poisoning their master or you're being accused of poisoning their master, you see that they're saying, no, I was just trying to soften his heart. I was putting something in his drink to kind of, so he wouldn't be so wicked with me and he wouldn't be so angry with me. And I realized that there's these multiple layers in the archives of well, maybe she was actually trying to poison him, but in the context of the court trial records, it will come out as her trying to save her life, or her trying to, she would tell another story, basically, kind of like Tituba did. So that got me into just thinking about, kind of using some of my writing and telling these different stories in a very almost allegorical and folkloric way. So that is a lot of the oral text, the things that I wrote. And so I was really thinking about also this idea of in the court records, you're just seeing evidences of these objects showing up, these bundle of sticks and these different things, and they were totally devoid of the meaning behind them, how people actually use these objects. And in thinking a lot about, my experiences living in Cuba, and also my experience living here, and knowing a lot of people who still practice a lot of these African based religions, and and thinking through a lot of the rituals that are still evident today, I kind of realized that the ritual was another sort of archive, and how these rituals for people trying to survive the brutalities of slavery and colonialism would have been so important for them, but also how these same rituals are passed down. So the piece I developed was a series of, some were rituals that are actually in existence today. People use them for various cleaning or connecting with ancestors. And some of them were invented, like the last one, which is where I'm washing coral stones. And that one came very much out of actually working on the monument, I Am Queen Mary. There was a point where when the coral stones were imported, this is the base of the monument, we had to clean, 1 ton of coral stones. And in that process of cleaning them, we were able to access a totally different kind of knowledge. Like, we all of a sudden started to think about, well, the coral stones were sharp. So how did these enslaved people, like, how did they manage cutting these things without gloves? We were using gloves to wash them. So how did they manage cutting them out of the ocean? All of a sudden you start to realize that they had to have these different ways of communicating. They probably had other types of, like, how did they get them from the ocean to the shore? How did they know how to cut? I mean, it all of a sudden you realize that just through the access of touching and embodying, that it opened up things that were not in the archives. So that's where this piece comes from, thinking about creating a piece that was using a series of rituals, marrying it with text. And so I just wanted to maybe end by just showing a clip from it. And then we can go into jump ahead a little bit more.
Spirits can seize you in the throat as they linger, looking for a voice. You can have my voice, but not my body. I will tell them that you burned with the others in fiery outrage, but that they did not kill your spirit. That's why you linger in the widest, hence oldest tree, and slip under the tongue of those who wander in search of memory.
So I'll end here. And I guess maybe I should stop sharing the screen now, or let's see, how do I do that? Stop sharing. All right.
Thank you so much, Lavon. That was very illuminating. And I love the way that you managed to bring up this notion of monumentality, which of course has been a central concern of ours from the beginning. And I guess, yeah, really trying to problematize how does one approach this very fragmented history, which appears in all different forms of fragmented forms through the body, through archives and everything in between. I have a question about the kind of more the formal tactics within the video itself of you engaging your own body, and how, you talked about the body as a tool, as an archival kind of tool within thinking about rituals, for example, but then putting that onto your own body and engaging your own body is something I would love to hear you talk about.
Yeah. I think, I had also recently written an article talking about the monuments that won't fall, which is in the book that you guys kindly asked me to republish. And it was thinking, you know, almost thinking about these histories that are embodied and encoded inside of us, that we are actually the monuments that won't fall. And it feels especially significant, you know, being in the Virgin Islands, being in the place where we are living in archives and monuments to the colonial history. It's not like, you know, in the piece, there's this image of a sugar mill, which in a way is another kind of monument. The sugar mills are the places where there would have been these two rolling pins where you would have taken the sugar cane and pushed it through. And, you know, these are incredibly violent symbols of colonialism, but they've also been full of nostalgia. Like people turn them into like Airbnb residences, or people have wedding pictures done in front of them and things like that. But when I see them, I see the fact that there were people who their job was to stand there with the cutlass and cut off people's hands, because it wasn't when, you know, there was often people when they're pushing through the cane that their hands would be cut off. So it's like, for me, it's been a way of, you know, moving through a space like this that has so much violence. It's that it's like, how do you live in a space that has so much violence? Like, it's on our bodies, it's in our bodies, it's on the freckles on my face. And so I think for me, it was really important to try to, as I've been moving through different ways of thinking through archives, to use my body as a tool to do that. And, you know, as I said, just in terms of my practice as an investigative tool, like for me, it was very, you know, I wanted to feel, what would it feel like to do these rituals in these spaces? Even that final scene where it's my children actually, and they're playing in front of the sugar mill. I had had this idea for a long time. I had wanted to just kind of see the innocence and their joy in the context of this violence, because that's kind of what we do, right? So we're moving through this space, we're living our lives, we're raising our kids, we're having carnivals, we're doing all these things in these incredibly also violent spaces. And I wanted to kind of juxtapose that in a way, juxtapose our bodies with these histories and the violence and the joy and the peace and the, you know, the healing, as well as a lot of these practices were also very much about healing. And, you know, things like the, when I'm pouring the molasses, you know, those are practices that deal, like rituals that deal with connecting to the ancestors and connecting to these histories. And I thought that was, I wanted to feel what that was like. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that last scene is so powerful, and I think that there's something that you've talked to us about this idea of the pedagogy of the doing, and so what it kind of means to enact certain kind of historical rituals, but also what feels kind of pertinent within the moment, and the kind of like the ghostly murmurs that you've talked about when encountering these different kind of architectures and landscapes, and doing so with your own children. I mean, I don't know, it's just quite powerful. And I think the video was just so important for the show, and having this kind of two-channel and duality of your perspective and your body moving through the landscape alongside the kind of objects and materialities of this space was, yeah, just a really important contribution for the show. So
yeah.
Thank you.
It's strange because it's one of the first times I've done a work that I didn't really get to see it. You know, I mean, it's one thing working on it on your screen and another being able to see it in the space. So, you know, I lament that, but that's just part of the condition that we're living in right now with the pandemic. But thank you for that.
Thank you. I think just for the sake of time, we're going to keep going. So thank you, Vaughn. And in the spirit of the kind of relational, we're going to move on to Youmna Chlala right now. So Youmna, whenever you're ready, you can start screen sharing.
Thank you. Thank you both very much for inviting me to participate in the show, for your thoughtfulness, for our 3 years of engaging in this maybe, and really for the vision that you had in bringing all of these variants of ideas together in this way. And thank you to Charlottenborg, everybody there, for making it possible to create a new work during the environment that we're in. It feels like an incredible privilege to make something new at this moment. And for that, I'm grateful to Milena, who led me to Rasmus, who led me to Camila, who led me to the Emmas, all people who really allowed for the object to come into being. So I'm going to share. And sorry, one second. I'm going to talk about this work in the context of the larger, maybe landscape of my work that it exists in, which is the Museum of Future Memories. The Museum of Future Memories is a project that began a few years ago as a way to kind of think about how we consider the horizon line disappearing, how we can no longer tell the difference between sea and sky, how we can take a speculative process and move it away from the language of finance or the language of the apocalyptic and bring it back into the body. And so the work really is about a kind of reconstitution of memory as a kind of speculative process. And the horizon line is there as a way to kind of think through what it is that we know from where we are. So the horizon line is the way that we make sense of where we are. And if it's disappearing, if the sea and sky are no longer apart and discernible, then how do we make sense of where we are? So this project whose current iteration is the object that is no longer floating in the gallery, which is She Holds the Wind in a Bag, that is her power, began with Alison's really beautiful exhibition called An Unbound Knot in the Wind, in which I worked on a series of assemblages, collages, and text that had to do with the Finnmark 17th century witch trials. And that was my first experience with sort of thinking through historical material that was very distant from me up until that point. A lot of the work I had done was related to me in my own personal life, or the landscapes in which I had moved through. And this was a kind of maybe a wandering into history, a wandering into what we can be told through narrative. So much of the narrative that exists about this moment comes in the form of court records. And the court records and the language that was used to narrate the stories of these accused women and men reminded me a lot of the language that we use when we are redlining and red listing native plants or native animals, and when we speak about migration and immigration. So the language was really demarcating what is alien and what belongs, who or what is part of the space and who is othered and alien. And so this work is a combination of the research I did about the Finnmark trials and also looking at the native plants in the Hudson Valley in the museum, which is where the museum was located. So it was installed in a gallery space that had a beautiful cut through the wall. And so it's called The Cut is a Gathering. One of the ways in which women were implicated in witchcraft was through the gathering. was through the ways that they came together in intimate moments. And I really wanted the work to reflect what it means to come together and to take note of where you are. And this beautiful light created a kind of shift in the gallery space, so that when the weather changed, or depending on the time of day, the work could be viewed in different ways. And I wanted to read a couple of the notational texts, which were kind of texts that I wrote in response to the research, because they give you a sense of what I'm trying to think through. The assemblage, or the collage, for me is a way of conjuring. There's something about reinscribing meaning by proximity, which is what these drawings and assemblages did. And so the notational text was handwritten in the back, and the handwriting was a way for me to sort of reinsert my body into this along with the drawing. So I'm going to read just a couple of lines. The identification of the species is entrusted in the citizen, the good citizen, who finds clues, takes a photo, pulls it out, expels it. They protect the natives. Teach the use of the flower. Do this by bringing in all flowers possible. Show that as the flower fades, the fruit becomes evident. She holds the wind inside a bag. That is her power. You are magic, like excavated rhizomes growing after months without water, and seeds germinating after being burnt in late summer. So I'm going to move through the variances of the Museum of Future Memories. This piece actually came before the one I just showed, and in part I wanted to show it for a couple of reasons. One is the relationship to weather. At the time of the witch trials, in particular in Denmark, it was known as the Little Ice Age, and I was really interested in the way that we as a society and past societies, future societies, look for a reason, look for meaning in catastrophe. Like, what is it that we are looking for when we are ascribing fault in people for what is happening at a kind of large level? And the Ice Age brought about catastrophic conditions in terms of weather, and in particular, women and men would be blamed, for example, for causing unexplainable storms or unexplainable droughts. And they were kind of used as a way to make sense of what we could not make sense of. So this piece is part of a project on the Lofoten Islands for the Lofoten Biennale that Milena Hochsberg and Heidi Ballet held in 2017. And this is about the color blue. It's called How Many Tongues Does It Take to Make a Color? And it was text that was inserted on the islands. And the reason I wanted you to kind of spend time with it is because in the process of thinking speculatively about what it means to imagine a future that is filled with knowledge of what is happening, but is not apocalyptic, I began to think about temperature and about the temperature of language and the temperature of color, and really landed on the color blue as a way to make sense of how we identify future colors. And so for me, blue is the color of the future, in part because it is one of the last colors to be named in multiple languages, in part because for so long, people saw the sea as purple and as yellow and not as blue. And for so long, they saw the sky as a void, and not an emptiness, but a void. And I was really interested in how language allows us to name what we imagine and to believe that it's going to come into being. So this is a piece that was installed on the islands, and part about the kind of power of language and the power of naming through color. So the cutting of tongues is not meant to be necessarily about a graphic removal, but about ritual. What's ritualed on these beautiful architectural cod drying racks is that as teenagers, the kids on the island would come up and take away the tongues of the cod before they were dried, so that they would get sort of play money. And I loved imagining the kind of conversations that were happening while these teenagers were there pulling out these fleshy tongues. So this takes me to another piece, which is about intimacy. One of the ways in which the witches were accused, and one of the primary ways, was through their associations. So who you knew and how you knew them. Did you cross the threshold into their domestic space? Did you cross the threshold into their familial space? And the stories I heard and I had a chance to kind of speak about with the historians that Alison and Jeppe put me in touch with, Louise and Livelin, were really about these beautiful moments where women crossed the threshold. So you could be implicated by spending time with your friend in their bedroom, because the bedroom was a private space. The field was a private space. You were seen giving somebody a piece of butter who was implicated in the trial. You were seen sharing fish with someone. You were seen sort of giving somebody a glass of milk. These were small ways that were about exchange, that were about friendship, that were about intimacy, that were then identified as being against religious, familial, and state power. So this is a piece in Sao Paulo called Love Seats. It's also a part of the Museum of Future Memory. And the reason I wanted to kind of show it as part of this is because this is a piece that's actually interested in the spine as an architectural detail, as a way to kind of hold memory. And these love seats I made as really active spaces, in part to kind of think through like what happens in nearness. What happens is in nearness, when we are proximate with each other, is play. And play becomes ritual, and ritual becomes play. And that is exactly what a lot of these women were accused of. They were accused of their connection. They were accused of having tendrils of memory. And so what did they do to counter this accusation? They invented narrative. And the thing I found most spectacular about the research was the court records themselves at certain points were extremely elaborate. So you would have descriptions, for example, of women who were accused of shape-shifting. So transforming into birds that were sitting on top of water, speaking with each other. But the women would describe what that was like. They would talk about the clothes they were wearing. They would talk about who was near them, what kind of birds they had become. So during the moment in which it was really their, in a kind of clear way, their final chance to have a voice, they invented and they created narratives and they created stories that I feel like it's not so much to think about as fiction or not fiction, but really as a kind of reckoning with where they were through language, through narrative, through their own invention and voice. And I was really moved by that kind of liberation in that context. And I began to think about movement, and I began to think about the weather and the power to control the weather. And as I read in the line for the previous work, I had written down sort of really haphazardly the line, she holds the wind in a bag. And I began to think about the bag as a container, and what happens when you contain the uncontainable. Wind is an element that I have always hated. I used to say for a long time, like, if I could take away one element, it would be the wind, because it chills you to the bone. But as I spent time kind of thinking about it and thinking about what it means, I was so interested in how it's only through the movement of another object or another body that we understand and we calculate the presence of wind. And so I began to really research this insistence, like how we insist on knowing that wind is there because we have seen something else move. And I really loved the idea of containing the gesture, containing the shift that wind creates inside of an object, especially because so much of the magic that these people were accused of holding transpired in a cup, a container, a vessel, a bag. There were the objects that mediated between the intimate and the quotidian. And so for me, the bag as an object became really important, not so much because of what you can hold, but I guess what you can contain. It's an object that is meant to be close to the body. It's meant to be a space where we gather what we cannot create ourselves and what we cannot hold ourselves. And I researched the form of the bags that existed at the time of the witch trials, and I sort of placed them up against our relationship to future bags. And what became really important for me was not just the object, but the gesture. And so the bag is composed of linen. The linen thread was woven and dyed hand dyed with a blue pigment. And the linen is flax, and flax has a kind of mythology in Denmark. There, I found this really interesting sort of offhand proverb about that no one would lack clothing if they greeted a flax field when passing. And I love this idea of the relationship to nature, that if you acknowledge the field from which your clothing comes from, then you will never feel a lack. So the weaving took place on the object itself, and it took place with many hands that were not my own. And I think in this case that felt really incredible, because even from a distance, I was able to kind of have a collective relationship to the object. For me, I think the object is a mediating force. It's the way that we can encounter space through our bodies, but it's also a way in a way that it's a dream. I think an object like this is, it's very important that it's as much part of the imaginary as it is spatially integrated into the space, so that you're not quite sure if it's present or absent. It relates to kind of the physical intimacy that this type of object can create. And I sort of wanted to end with an offhand conversation that happened with one of the historians, Liv Elen, when we were speaking about the trials. And she's been doing this for a really long time, and she's extremely dedicated to the dignity of the people whose stories she researches. And as I was telling her about my own projects, she started to talk to me about how she herself is really interested in the horizon. And I wanted to just read you what she was telling me about looking out from the Lofoten Islands. She said, I would stare and I could never find the meeting point. I haven't been able to catch it. The light is transparent and you get a feeling that the ground is floating. You seek and what you're seeking is disappearing in front of your eyes. You want it to be there so much. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Youmna.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so beautiful. And thank you for being such a champion, as many are that have been on this call, about working at a remove on a project that is so much about intimacy and relationships. And I know that you kind of formed a real dialogue with the artists that you were working with who were in Copenhagen. And I was just wondering if, obviously you and I we all spoke so much about the kind of challenges of making work at a distance during a pandemic, but I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about, there's such a focus in kind of intimacy and the relational in your work. And so for me, this work still, it does really evoke a sense of intimacy, and it invites you to get really close to it, to kind of look at the places where the dye fades in and out, to look at the texture and the kind of wrapping process. And so I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit about what it was like to make a work that is so much about kind of closeness and proximity at a moment when we're all so far apart. And if that was kind of like an opening for you, if it was challenging for you, how that felt and how it might have even changed your process.
It was super easy. It was challenging, but it was also liberating. I think what was really beautiful about it was this idea that I had to figure out different ways of explaining and imagining and transcribing and translating the process of making, but also being okay with whatever happened. So it was a kind of this release of control, but also a kind of moment of collective exchange. And I think what was particularly, for me, it feels all connected, our conversations. I think you meeting with the two of you was probably one of the last meetings I had before the lockdown in New York. So it kind of stayed with me in a real physical way because of the circumstances. And then the process of sort of working with people who I didn't know very well was also kind of, I feel, part of this entire project. That's what it means to look at archives. You're working with people who you don't know. It's part of the research process. It's part of the way that things align in strange, unexpected ways when you're making work. And though I wasn't there to kind of maybe feel the texture of the object, I was very happy to have it kind of mediated by like a WhatsApp photo or a drawing, or having to scribble notes. And I think that was like, in a way, and in retrospect, it made the project even more meaningful. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really good to hear. I know it was challenging, but it's such a beautiful and powerful work. And we really noticed a lot of people kind of coming into close contact and examining and being slow with it. And then, of course, taking time to look at the book of weather magic, which was in the gallery. And so kind of thinking about the relationships between the seemingly distant past and the future, as the Museum of Future Memories allows us to do. It was just a really important contribution for the show. So thank you.
Thank you.
And I think we're gonna move next to Aviva Silverman is going to present on Meineche.
Okay. So all the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. In Kimberly Patton's book, The Sea Can Wash Away All Evil, Modern Marine Pollution and the Ancient Cathartic Ocean, she writes, "The illusion of the sea's endless depth, and hence its ability to contain all that it receives, is made not only by the submerged landscape of its black chasms, ravines, and valleys, but also by the fact that efforts to find its steepest point have repeatedly failed. Just as the sea has traditionally been a place of non-being, formlessness, and death, it has also been an appropriate place for pollution. The sea could dispose of and render harmless that was too morally, religiously, and psychically dangerous to exist on land." Prior to putting this presentation together, I was thinking a lot about magic, how it lives through time and exchanges and ceremony, and how its power, when in the hands of femmes and abject people in different histories, have been demonized and punished for it. I was thinking about the mourner's Kaddish the other day, which is a Jewish prayer said for those that have passed on. I've said it a lot this year, and yet I just learned that there's no mention of death at all within it. It's an invocation celebrating the divine. A lot of the focus of my work has been on icons of protection and healing, focused primarily on the Abrahamic faiths. I started collecting mass-made religious icons from a factory in Italy as a way of understanding how the sacred is summoned through material, aka plastic. What I found were discarded saints and other folks melted, misshapen, and headless due to manufacturing issues. This piece was a ready-made found in the pile. From the discards, I made this piece for my solo at the Swiss Institute called Assimilation. I began to search within my own identity vortex for why these Catholic and a mix of Greek figures were preserved through millennium and prayer, worship, iconography, and effigy, and how their material footprint pointed to another realm, that of historical erasure. People, beliefs, and ideas disappeared into the project of monumentalization. I tried to think of imagery of religious people from my own upbringing and couldn't picture any, mostly because Judaism is more focused on language formation and commentary due to its history of nomadism. "My sweet little sisters, birds of the sky," Francis said, "you are bound to heaven, to God your creator, and every beat of your wings and every note of your songs. Praise him, he has given you the greatest of gifts, the freedom of air." St. Francis of Assisi. Meaning wanders like human tribulation, or like error, from text to text and within a text from figure to figure. What governs this wandering, this errancy, is defense, the beautiful necessity of defense, for not just interpretation is defense, but meaning itself is defense. This quote refers to an era of this bowl, a time period when Jews were actively involved in trying to understand losing sovereignty over land and having no temple. Jewish worship couldn't be in a physical place. Their focus became more concentrated on what to do in the absence of a temple. What do we do with a book without a temple? Our body becomes a constellation. Body, text, temple will all live in the same world. Coming back to Queen City Special, a miniature train that travels in infinite loops, its movement is an incantation in its cycles, celebrating people who have radiated radical speech acts to counteract systems of oppression. The real people rendered on this train have often suffered cruel instances of social intimidation and persecution. Following the legacy of the accused, it was important to me not to just name the people who have been influenced in my life, but build an homage to them, since protective icons have always given me guidance in my life. Here's an excerpted video that I hope plays for you guys of the installation. Oh my God, the vacuuming. Oh, oops. Okay. No. Oh. Great. So I'm just going to describe some of the people on the train. The conductor is Emma Goldman, as you can see. She played a crucial role in developing anarchist political philosophy in North America and Europe in the first half of the 20th century, and was imprisoned several times for inciting a riot and illegally distributing information about birth control. After one of her many arrests from prison, she was deported to Russia. Rona Sugarlove featured sitting on an ambulance as she was employed as a driver during the early days of COVID. She was born in Puerto Rico and served 35 years in prison for self-defense. Since the installation of this piece, she was sent back to Rikers and is awaiting trial. She's been a fearless advocate for trans women incarcerated and has taught me so much about being radical and abundant and having abundant kindness. JD Sampson is a genderqueer visual artist and musician and sings out of a tower. They are best known as 1/3 of the electronic feminist punk band La Tigra, whose songs are playing as the train travels. The train's cargo also holds remedies and fruits used for altar tables, including the likeness of garlic, pomegranate, lavender, figs, and eucalyptus that are drawn from earth-based Judaic religious practices. Kayan Dorshau is standing overlooking a sparkling green staircase. As founder of Gays and Lesbians Living in a Transgender Society, aka GLITS, she raised more than $1 million towards opening housing for local Black trans community in New York. I worked with Kayan on a discussion for the Department of Mental Health and Hygiene to raise attention towards trans health during COVID for policymakers to listen to and take inventory of. Born to a working Puerto Rican family in the Bronx, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is an American Democratic socialist who made headlines in 2018, becoming the youngest woman ever elected to Congress, or youngest woman ever elected to Congress. She's holding a balance of justice in a car filled with angels battling over pearls and fire. C.A. Conrad is a diviner and poet who wants somatic poetry and poetics to help us realize that everything around us has a creative viability with the potential to spur new thinking. They are seated at a table with tarot, holding a spiraling wand while seated on a landscape of fool's gold. Lastly, Madeline Gins with her husband, framed in miniature. Oh, sorry, this is a cart full of the eucalyptus and the figs that I was mentioning before. And lastly, Madeline Gins with her husband framed in miniature, that's kind of pointed in the opposite direction of this documentation. Arakawa wrote the Manifesto Architectural Body, a visionary theory of how the human body, architecture, and creativity define and sustain one another. I worked for their studio called Reversible Destiny throughout my 20s. Thank you, that's all I have.
Thank you, Aviva. That was really nice. And thank you for offering this like longer history of, I guess, like spiritual figuration, which I feel your work is really interesting because it connects these very ancient practices or cultures of representation with your personal biography and, plastic figuration, which I really love. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, I guess, in the connection with this exhibition and this show, because I know this project has had, the train has had numerous lives before. I wonder what it's just in the same way that any or many religions, will buy an icon or make icons to celebrate their faith. What is the power here of claiming the witch as one's personal icon, which is of course in many ways very ahistorical, and this is something that we in the show and between us have talked a lot about, the witch as a feminist icon, or an icon of political dissent or kind of societal dissent. How does the notion of an icon kind of offer a way through that question, which is so difficult to answer, and we've been confronted with a lot, I think.
Right. I mean, I think as you talked about in this panel so far, or in various talks, troubling the category of monumentalization, And also in terms of monumentalization is the idea of representation, which in its own categorical understanding of history is important. Like seeing the existence of people that are important and valuable to us, like, is extremely needed and necessary, and that can exist in many ways through multiple realms of historical lives, and it has. And so I think the icon isn't the most, I mean, it is for me in like working with material history, because I'm a sculptor and I just am obsessed with how things are made and the mechanics of that, and what the power of those materials holds, like plastics made to create the sacred, or an idea of like conjuring you towards a sacred idea of like transcendence and like godliness is like fascinating to me. And I love like the cheaper, like the most kind of like kitschy installations of that are like everywhere in many different, they're just expressed in so many different ways that aren't just like in the grandest forms of Europe in some marbleized church with like golden Virgin Marys. You know, it can be made out of anything. And I think that's why I was interested in the book that Kimberly Patton wrote, who I came upon while interested in angelology as like also an expression of a form, because angels have existed throughout all of art history and have always taken on the form of whoever conjured them into existence in the ways that they wanted them to exist. And so that's why they have so many different faces. So yeah, the icons have a shifting mode of communication and meaning for me, and they definitely don't inhabit obviously one form. That's the point, is that they're just malleable and manipulated as puppets in a way towards our own desire of what we need to feel or express. Although I guess we can also be filled with the spirit of God to create them, and then we're just not, perhaps that's not a puppet, perhaps that's something else, like a holy person.
That's really interesting, and I guess in terms of the witch, like the witch too is this icon that's, you know, just been circulating ambiently for hundreds and hundreds of years in pop culture, and before that religious culture. You know, some of the earliest representations of witches happened you know, on paintings in churches, where you see sometimes very sexual scenes between the devil and the witch, and these live on today. But then I guess moving into a more pop cultural space by way of like sort of Halloween kind of Harry Potter era of the witch, and who also has, even that super commercialized kind of commodified notion of a witch, still has so much power, and kind of spiritual power actually too, and emotional psychic power. And I think, you know, during the process of this project, the whole J.K. Rowling thing kind of was kind of exploding in the internet sphere, and it was so interesting to hear all these trans kind of critics and thinkers come out and actually defend and love how much their love for the Harry Potter saga was, despite these extremely kind of insensitive and transphobic comments by its author. So I think that also just says that like icons always are drifting, and one can always make them meaningful to oneself and to one specific location and context. And I think that's something you've done really beautifully while thinking about a very specific history of sculptural religious figuration, I guess. And it's everyone who saw it was such a showstopper, this train, everyone who came in, and sort of I think we have a natural we naturally drift towards these kind of objects because we're used to seeing them.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aviva. We will move on to a duo, Reba, Maybury, and Sidsel Meineche Hansen, who collaborated on a commission. And yeah, take it away.
Hi, Sidsel.
Hello.
Hi, Alison. Hi, Jeppe. Thanks so much for having us. You're muted, Sid.
Hi.
I think we should just get into it. We're going to start by showing our film, if you don't mind. So I'm just going to share the screen. And then we're going to share the screen again. Sorry about that. Here you go. Can everyone see this?
Yes.
You can see it. Great. So that was a film we made, and the music was by Joanne Robertson, a dear friend of ours, musician and artist. So it's a collaboration between the three of us, the film, and then there were also these copper prints which were on display, which were there were prints from these copper prints in the film that you saw, which were also on display in the exhibition. And the name of the work is 12 Rules for Life. So I suppose we kind of want to discuss where we got this name from and where the idea stemmed from. Here's a still of what the film looked like in the show as well. It was directly opposite the copper plates, and then we felt very privileged to have Carol Rama in the same room as us as well. So the idea for this work stemmed from me and Sidsel are, very good friends, and we have a mutual fixation with the psychologist Jordan B. Peterson, a Canadian psychologist who over the last couple of years has become incredibly famous for his online YouTube lectures, but recently this book he's written called 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. And he's a controversial figure and made a lot of headlines because he was very against people changing their pronouns, amongst other things. And he wouldn't call himself sexist, but there is significant reason to believe he is sexist. And there seems to be a lot of lost men now following him. And me and Sidsel decided, in the context of thinking about the witch trials, how do we understand contemporary misogyny now, and where does it stem from? Because misogyny doesn't go anywhere. It always exists, like any form of bigotry. So how do we understand where it's evolving to? And with Jordan Peterson, he's become this sort of father figure for a lot of these kind of lost, young, predominantly white men in America, Canada, Australia, and Europe. Other parts of the world too, but predominantly there. So we started looking at this book. So in the book 12 Rules for Life, there are 12 rules. So and then the book is called The Antidote to Chaos. And in the book, chaos is essentially described as the female. And in the wonderful stereotypes of gender is that men are rational and serious and women are chaotic and hysterical and emotional. So the book is almost like these kind of ridiculous rules to be stoic and strong and lack emotion and be rational. So going on from there, we decided to rewrite the rules ourselves. So the first rules are Jordan Peterson's rules, and then myself and Sidsel rewrote them. So the first one says, stand up straight with your shoulders back, which we said, erect yourself. The second one is treat yourself like someone you're responsible for helping. We said, never salute him at the rally. Make friends with people who want the best for you. Compare yourself to who you were yesterday, not to who someone else is today. Do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. That was one of our personal favorites. When I first read it, I thought it's don't do anything that will make your children dislike you, but it's actually the other way around. Set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. If you go on Jordan Peterson's Instagram, there are these wonderful photos he sometimes posts where his fans send photos of their bedrooms with their beds made as an example of this rule. And it's so beautifully tragic. These like sad men's bedrooms with beds they've made. Pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Assume the person you're listening to might know something you don't. Be precise in your speech. Do not bother children when they're skateboarding, and pet a cat when you encounter one on the street. So my practice as an artist revolves around my other job, which is being a dominatrix and decimating and understand the power dynamics and politics of sex work and the tangible reality of my domination as fantasy, fetish, and job, and the labor behind that. So what we did is myself and Sidsel got together and we got all of these rules, and I sent them to different submissives and got them to illustrate the rules. So we got each submissive, well, I have multiple submissives, I'm not even sure how many worked on this. They did it virtually, so I'd text them and give them a rule. For example, this one here is stand up straight with your shoulders back. And I asked the submissive to draw it, and I didn't give them context. And then for each rule, we got about 3 or 4 different drawings done, and then we decided which ones we liked the best. So each one of these plates has been done by one of my submissives, illustrating one of Jordan Peterson's rules. And then in the film, we had our rewritten rule to go with it. And the reason we showed them on copper plates, Sidsel is going to go into explaining more. But these are some of, they're not in order actually, so I apologize about that, but each one is one of the rules, and it's quite fun to try and identify. Oh, you know, see, this one is don't interrupt a child when it's skateboarding. Pet a cat when you see one on the street. But I don't know, Sidsel, maybe you want to go ahead.
Yeah, I could say a little bit about, like, I guess that with reference to like thinking about the archives and also thinking about like the arrival of the printing press and how the printing press became kind of like a vehicle for the dissemination of like the idea of like the witch, or kind of like a form of like, at that point, a contemporary form of kind of like dissemination around the idea of like misogyny. We were thinking about these parallels to kind of like the printing press and like dry point prints. So it's copper plates, and I guess that Reba and I were kind of like transferring the drawings that Reba's subs had produced to illustrate Jordan Peterson's 12 rules. And I guess that, yeah, so there's a series of prints that accompany like the printing plates. And as Reba said, those were kind of like scanned and included in the video, Day of Wrath. And so Day of Wrath is, it's a remake. So Carl Theodor Dreyer made a film in 1945 called Day of Wrath. And so as, I mean, the original film is about a Danish, a prosecution of a woman who's considered or accused of being a witch. And so we decided to remake that film for that reason, but also the introduction to that film comes with these kind of like very iconographic and quite kind of like Christian motifs for kind of like illustrating like the 10 rules of or the 10 commandments. And so there is also this kind of like way that Jordan Peterson's kind of conservative and kind of like, you know, Christian values were kind of like referenced through the medium of kind of like the printing press in relation to like how the introduction to Day of Wrath from 1945 kind of yeah, illustrated this. And the soundtrack to the Day of Wrath is then this track that Joanne Robertson improvised on top of. So we kind of like reversed that track, which is a track that was usually played at funerals, like a death mass. So we kind of like played that in reverse, and then Joe would improvise on top of it. But I guess that yeah, I kind of lost my trail of thought a little bit, but I think that that's what I wanted to say in relation to the prints and also in relation to the film. Like in the original film, there's also kind of like the Day of Wrath soundtrack, or kind of requiem, is like happening when the witch is burnt at the stakes. And so there was also this reference to kind of like that moment in the film.
And I suppose for us, it was also the idea of like, well, how do you prosecute someone? There has to be a set of laws or rules in place, like a value system, a moral code. And that's what, you know, the witch trials were based on. There were these ideas of being wrong or right, or guilty or innocent. And these rules still permeate our lives in some capacity and create segregations, whether it's through colonial history or gender now. And with these 12 sort of rules that Jordan Peterson's doing, it's what Sidsel said, it's still mirroring that to some capacity. And I suppose we both find it fascinating that men still feel the need to have a set of rules to live by, that they can't govern themselves. And then when we do, I mean, I asked quite a variety of different submissives I have from different ages and backgrounds. They're all white, however, and how kind of immature their drawings are also becomes a part of the humiliation, that these are grown men and their ability to express themselves is so tragically immature. I mean, for me as a dominatrix, I find great pleasure in seeing their kind of immaturity. But when you pair that with the severity of what Jordan Peterson is actually saying, it becomes really quite dark, I suppose. Like there's the one with the guy going down on the girl that looks like the hell mouth. I mean, what did he say for that one, Sid? The rule for that one is the one that says, let's just find it. We gave him the rule, do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. And the submissive here sent this one in the middle. And I said to him, well, what's that got to do with you doing something, your children doing something that you would make them that would make you dislike them? And he said, oh, well, if my child became a prostitute, I wouldn't like them anymore. And that's what this illustration's of. So I think that was one of the highlights of the illustrations, because it was just so profoundly juvenile, and shows how kind of stunted so many people's ideas of sexuality, freedom, repression, and pleasure still are, and how that's so intertwined with how we all see one another as human beings. So yeah. I mean, this one here on the left, is that the left? I don't know my left and right. Yeah, the left is more incel-y, because also Jordan Peterson is kind of this father figure, and that kind of trickles down into incel and alt-right culture as well. This kind of like sad little guy on his computer and the chads at the top. So, but also we wanted to exhibit the copper plates rather than the prints. So it's a way of taking the means of production even further away from the submissive. So me as the dominatrix and Sidsel as my friend, we take away their agency from the work, and they have to give total agency to me as their dominatrix. They have to work for me to empower me further, and my friends as well, whoever I choose. So by exhibiting the printing plates rather than the prints, it's saying, well, we have the originator of this, and we can produce these drawings as much as we want, and you can't. So I think that's it, really. What do you think, Sid?
I think that's a really good. If there's anyone who has questions, that would be interesting. I don't know if the people who are kind of listening might have questions.
I'm checking the Facebook feed, and I haven't seen a question, but I have a question, which is that you've touched a little bit on incel culture, and when I've spoken to people about your project, they don't always know kind of what incel culture is. So I guess it would be interesting to hear you speak a little bit about this kind of relationship between, as we've gotten into a little bit, technology, and how technology, of course, is a form of dissemination for these ideas of all kinds, and how they were certainly during the witchcraft trials, but again, thinking about the kind of the technology of the printing plate in relation to the kind of technology of the chat room and of the kind of incel culture that exists online, which we're seeing kind of how pernicious and deep that goes. And so especially given what's gone on, at least for me here living in the United States recently, and thinking about Parler and kind of all of these different channels and modes of kind of, fueling hate and fueling dialogues that we're not really aware are there if we're not kind of looking for them. So I was just interested in hearing you speak a little bit about how incel culture has kind of inspired some of this project, and specifically thinking about Jordan Peterson and the different channels of technology that have kind of converged.
Well, I think I can speak on behalf of me and Sidsel here, is that we're both interested in extremes of behavior, especially like extreme sexual modes of behavior. And incels are like a very extreme formation of contemporary male, some areas of male contemporary culture, not all of it, but for people who don't know what an incel is, it's the abbreviation of involuntarily celibate, which means there's a group of men who exist online that I don't think they ever really meet each other in person, and they hate feminism so much because they believe that feminism has taken away their kind of God-given right to have access to women as freely as they like. So they hate women so much because of that they choose not to have sex. They choose to be celibate, but they also hate other forms of masculinity. So they hate kind of what they call chads, who are the strong, successful, muscly, gym going guy with lots of money. So incels kind of pride themselves on being these kind of like weaklings who live in their mother's basements and spend 18 hours a day playing video games and talking about how depressed they are online. And politically, they're inherently nihilistic and libertarian. I mean, for me, I've had quite a few run-ins with submissives who are incels, and not even submissives, but I've been in I was in a media storm a couple of years ago where I stumbled across forums about me written by incels, which was very, very violent. So I have I definitely have like a personal fixation with their behavior and the effects of it and where this will go, because it's very much about, they've come out of a culture of isolation, like digitally induced isolation as well. So they can be as extreme as they want online. They can be as extreme as they want online. And they can say whatever they want online without it really affecting their day-to-day life, but their mental health is kind of destroyed. So I suppose in context of technology, they have these computers where they can vomit whatever they want, but their day-to-day lives aren't necessarily transgressive, but their actions online are.
And I think this project that you did has been so crucial for the overall argument of the show, to sort of pinpoint, without doing too much of a kind of direct kind of comparison between 300 years ago and now, is really to see how pervasive this idea of the woman, but of specifically female sexuality, both being extremely dangerous and always inferior, and something that must be made inferior or weak. And this is something that comes up in the imagery of the time, and but also, as we've talked about, the relationship between the devil and the witch. The witch first being the sort of all-powerful, actually using the devil as her submissive, as her assistant, as her aid in a way. But then at one point during the witchcraft trials, this power position inverting, and then you get into this more this later stage of the witch being a servant of the devil. And I mean, pop culture at this time, I guess, had these ideas and these demonizations of female sexuality had just had free reign, and it comes all out in the sort of representation at the time. And I think your project shows that these ideas have not gone away, but rather they've just drifted into other spaces and other technological spaces, image spaces, and cultural spaces. Yeah, I don't know if that's not really a question, but more an applaud to the two of you for making a very actually complicated and very wide-spanning connection between two historical moments. Shall we continue, I guess, for respect of time? Thank you, Sidsel and Reba. That was really nice. We will move on to new Noveta.
Should I put the pictures up?
Yeah. Okay. Is that working, Ellen?
Give me a second.
So we wanted to thank you, thank Jeppe and Alison for inviting us and for being understanding along the way in this quite precarious time. And we really appreciate you sharing some of your archival material with us, especially introducing us to Jacqueline van Gent's work, Magic, Body and the Self in 18th century Sweden, which has been really relevant to our research. So we are Keira Fox and Ellen Freed, performance duo New Noveta, based in London and Örebro, Sweden. We've been performing together for almost a decade now. Our practice spans various disciplines: prop and costume making, sound production, installation building, and live body action. Our practice is often collaborative, working mostly with friends who are fellow artists, musicians, and designers. For people that are unfamiliar with our performance work, there's a picture now of our our show Fateful, which was at the Conservatory in Freiburg in 2018, that dealt with themes around water law, water spirits, and political social power structures, and financial terror of the oppressed people. We channeled historical events where power has been inflicted on people with water by floods or by poisoning of water, for example, and how this relates to the dread of financial pressure, like paying your rent to a landlord, and the weaponization of these necessities. So we'll go straight into our commission now. So for the project Hagen, we collaborated with musician Jasper Majinks for the installation and performance sound, Tova Fried on full hand-knitted costumes, and Rose Keys on the production of our steel rails. We also worked with makeup artist Christabel Riley on the makeup direction.
Yes, so we received funding from the Swedish Arts Council, IASPIS, and we used this money to visit the island of the Blue Maiden, or Blåkulla, which you can see a picture of here in the distance. And it's a small, inaccessible boulder in the shape of a reclining woman of the Swedish east coast. Seafarers have feared her and the rough sea surrounding her for thousands of years, sacrificing female items of clothing to grant safe passage. In some of the early maps of the area, the maiden was excluded, and that was not because she wasn't noticeable, but for some other reason. And she's the only island around, and it's much taller than any of the mainland. But when we were going there, due to the characteristically high winds, that resulted in several cancelled trips, so we weren't actually able to get to the island until the day that we were leaving on the third attempt. But the entrance to the research around the Blue Maiden is based on my experience of the Swedish Easter rituals that still incorporate pagan elements to this day, of children dressing up as witches, raiding for sweets before heading off to the Sabbath. It's a kind of Swedish version of trick-or-treating, really, and in a playful way, but all based around the mythology of the witch hunts. And the Blue Maiden as a lingering representation, a threat of alien outcast characters, punished women, and feared ancient holy place that took on the stigma of later Christian patriarchal fears. So the Blue Maiden has held ritual and spiritual significance for over 9,000 years. Archaeological finds show that people have been traveling there for over 9,000 years. Sorry, I'm just, okay. The European witch hunts arrived to Sweden. The Maiden was one of the places that was used as an incriminating place to accuse witches to have flown to as a site of debauched rituals and sin. This Blocksberg myth exists as a phenomenon in several places that endured witch hunts, and the Blue Maiden became one of the physical representations of this concept. And we also looked, as well as the Blue Maiden, we also looked at the myths of the Norse goddess Hel. It's another blue woman, and she was another outcast woman that male gods didn't like the look of. So they banished her and threw her to the underground, being beaten blue and bent in the fall. She became the guardian of the place with the same name as her Hel, or Helheim, the realm of the dead who died a non-glorious death. For instance, death whilst being bedridden by illness or suicide. So we tied all of this research in with looking at accounts of the accusations of people convicted of witchcraft. Of course, largely finding stories of women outcast by society for not conforming to societal expectations. The verdicts were cast by the community at large often, and the respectable married women of the town being the most reliable source of witness and moral stead.
So we we felt there were resonant parallels between the historical and the current day persecutions we're living through on vulnerable communities under capitalism, evoking ongoing fear and alienation in people. So for a long time, our work has been concerned with mental health and the societal structuring that leads to the deterioration of people's physical and psychological well-being and means to function day to day, and reflecting on the very present mental health crisis we are living through now. So we wanted O'Hagan to embody a form of resistance and aversion and somehow address these ongoing systems of control over vulnerable bodies, using the fence as a metaphoric and symbolic tool of defense and a barrier and a warning. So sadly, our performance was unable to take place as we'd hoped, and are still hoping to realize it fully this year. Our contribution to the exhibition was the installation the performance was to take place in, but it was never activated. It incorporates a three-piece tapestry made with ropes accumulated from years of our previous performances, dyed and interwoven with votive candles in a giant coarse weave, suspended on a rusting metal screen divider on wheels, with throws of valerian root infused liquid lingering underneath the tapestries. The shoes in the display burnt votive beeswax candles. We displayed an uneven amount of the shoes to signify distress and a chaos, also to have our presences in the room, especially with us never being able to arrive, and the shoes being a prop that was meant to be worn. Also this sort of image of a person struggling with one shoe, which we've often done in our performances. So it's somehow ongoing, that struggle. Also part of the installation are wrought iron spiked perches installed on the walls for us to step onto or hold onto in the performance in a raised and removed but precarious, fragile position. So the tapestry rail is to be used as a prop to simultaneously protect but also act as a threat, doused in the wax and valerian, making the tapestry something that could be a lightable thing, a danger, but that can also shield and work as a form of fence to be hidden or trapped behind. Also relating to the Swedish witch trials where women were accused of riding fences to Blakula. We hope the candles can eventually be lit for the rescheduling of the performance this year at a new venue. Unfortunately, we were never able to light them for the exhibition due to the Constel's safety regulations, which is understandable.
Okay, so let's talk a bit about the installation sound piece. So the installation sound piece is largely made up of our voices that are manipulated by Jasper to sound less human and more bird-like. There's an ancient Northern European way of casting a curse that terrifies your opponent by the mere sound of it. It's recounted in historical accounts as a blood-curdling sonic attack. We found this account in Bengt af Klintberg's collection of Swedish spells. This kind of curse is called galdra, and it's a way to emulate a loud, frightening bird call, like a cuckoo sound, for instance, which also is where the Swedish word for madness, galen, comes from, to say that you had been driven mad by such a spell. And this brings up the old perspective of illness and bad luck, that if you suffered, it was because someone else had wished upon you, or stolen your spirit. And it proves the power of words and the power of community, the destructive power of slander and public humiliation, as well as social shortcomings. And I'm going to try and share part of the sound if I can. Hang on. So I might have to stop sharing the screen for a second. So I can work out again how to do this.
Is it what?
So that's just a short piece of what was played in the exhibition, which we never really got to hear, sadly, in the room. I'm gonna
and it also, it will sort of relate to the performance sound when that finally happens as well.
I'm gonna try and carry on sharing the.
Yeah. So to go on to so we also had a scent, but for the scent and the costumes and makeup, we've taken from the flora on and around the island. The costumes are knitted with rescue wool from the area, hand-dyed by us with woad, which is naturally present in the region. The makeup is inspired by the protective spiral spells to diffuse evil with chaos. And the colour comes from the bruised purple stain of the Swedish blueberries, which are abundant on the maiden.
This is the costume design.
Yeah, this is one of our costume designs.
So that's the actual makeup.
This is, the staining.
And part of the costume. So, I mean, without being able to visit the installation or perform and having to bring it together from afar, it's hard to conclude Oheng. The live performance is usually quite a necessary action that needs to take place with all the elements and to fully embody these forms of resistance and conflict that we're dealing with. It was the first time for us to show a standalone work without our bodies being present or activating the work, so it's very new forced way of showing for us, but it's been interesting. Thank you so much for putting it together for us without us there.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you both. And I mean, you really are within this exhibition, the victims of the pandemic, because you are really performers, and we tasked you to have a kind of physical and material output, and you did a really good job. But of course, it really is a kind of a totemic object, and I think even installing it and kind of spending time with it and diffusing the Valerian root and stuff, like, it became quite clear that it's a ritualistic object, and I can't wait to realize it on the other side of this pandemic. I wanted to just a question on research, I guess, because that is what you have done and what we can talk about is, and this connects both to some of the research that Youmna talked about earlier, and certainly that Rasmus will get into as well. This sort of like really thick kind of matter of folklore as a source material, and as a Danish person, it was kind of incredible to get access to these super arcane, obscure accounts of practices and beliefs, and actually just realize that if you scratch just a little bit underneath this like hyper rational kind of capitalist society that the Nordic region is today, you find this really kind of rich like wealth of ideas. And I wanted to ask you what your how you managed to, as you were accessing this material, to sort of make it yours, or to kind of make it applicable and relevant to your own practice. Your work is so performative and it's very, very visceral, but I would never call it kind of occult or magical in any way. That's certainly not something I've ever thought of your work as to be. Your work speaks to the psyche in a very different way, and sometimes without much cultural reference, actually. It's really kind of a visceral experience, where this is much more, I guess, diving into the territory of like restaging magical practices and kind of embracing folklore as a real kind of like set of practices or as a resource of knowledge, which we've come across and against throughout this project of how does one kind of address and respect folklore, but also interrogate it in a critical way, of course.
I don't know, I feel like somehow in some ways it isn't really such a fast step, like even though our work isn't like physically looks in a traditionally like ritualistic way, I think all of our work is quite charged with meaning of the sort of acting out of the scene, and also looking at all of this research, like for instance Jacqueline Van so the book. I think it was really, that's not so much folklore, but looking at what women were subject to then, it didn't seem like it was so different from what we were experiencing. Well, that was looking at later stages when people weren't actually burnt on the stake, but it was still this sort of alienation of people like that are very much in positions like our own, now suffering from mental health issues, or not able to just slot in comfortably into societal expectations.
Yeah. And I guess there is also, like, though our work doesn't really associate with the occult or magic as such, I think that there's always been we've always had our own sort of form of rituals to sort of channel and vent these sort of continuous anxieties or emotions that we're trying to display. So in some way, it's not completely removed from some of the research we sort of we did, because there were sort of lots of sort of intuitive crossover practices somehow that we already felt we were practicing, but not in the most obvious way, more in a sort of unaware sort of way, if that makes sense.
No, that makes.
Sorry, like it's also relevant to go into talk that about like folklore or history, or like reading these historical accounts. It's so easy to think, oh, back then witches, this and that. It's like seems so removed and such a fairy tale, and that's what the thing of reading about all of these accounts, how things just ring so true still, of how you're just like very sort of judged by your peers or judged by society, and I don't think things have changed that much. So I don't think it's really. It can seem like, oh, looking into oldie worldy things is not, and people are often judged in a way where they haven't like practiced anything witchy as well. So I think that's the often like thing that you think that people would judge because they were probably witches and they must like pointy hats, or they like warts or herbs or whatever, and it's just, I guess it's bringing this that was still like a witch hunt going on today, but people are sometimes called witches, but not as often.
No, I think it's a really important comment to make, and really is something that Alice and I spent a lot of time thinking about, to tease out the social within folklore, because folklore is nothing but it's just story, but there's actually, instead of instrumentalizing it really directly and say making statements like witches were like feminists, just like point blank, like full stop, it's rather to draw out the social politics of folklore and of this time and of these histories, and how one can approach these with contemporary concerns of like mental health, for example, or gender, or and I think that's been the real trick also in our mediation and mediation of your work and everyone else's work and our own work, is to say it's not that easy, but one, like, you need to sort of invite people in to sort of critique even what knowledge is and to kind of, and what history is, right? That, like, of course it isn't the same as it was 400 years ago, but at the same time there are lots of structures that are still in place. Yeah,
and sorry, Keira, were you gonna say something?
No, you go.
I was just gonna double back on that and say that I think also your kind of choice of the Valerian route and using materials that had kind of existed at other performances, and the wax and this kind of architectural structure. I mean, I think that there's a kind of there's a resistance to the idea of imaging a witch, and instead there's something that's really quite sensorial and embodied when you're in relation to that installation. And I know that will also come when the performance does, that it causes you to kind of feel into this history versus it being really illustrative. And so I think that just added so much to the show and to our thinking around what it means to kind of look back while being present. So yeah, so we're really grateful, and we really missed you at the show, and we'll figure out a way for the performance to happen still, of course.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.
Shall we move on to our final speaker, Rasmus? Rasmus, are you there?
Oh, hi. Sorry, I had to unmute.
The classic.
How are you?
Thank you, Rasmus, for joining us and for finishing this very lovely day of talking.
Yes. Well, thanks for having me. I will share here my little screen. There we go. Voila. Yes, I will be speaking about my contribution to the exhibition, my installation called Salon des Refusés, which was a full room sculptural installation that included 41 more or less human-sized characters that embodied sort of the kin of the figure of the witch. So just like Noveta just mentioned, Blåkulla, another place that in Danish folklore it is said that the witch goes to is Bloksberg in Germany, or it used to be Troms in Norway. This idea of like sending the witch far away, and I had this idea that maybe this place that she was going, this place that she was being sort of sent off to, included a lot of the other folkloric figures who also sort of had been rejected or pushed outside. And maybe in that spirit, they could also find, I'll return to this later, but they could also find a sort of unity in being rejected from this society. So as to say, the folkloric spirits that people used to either believe or talk about more, that they sort of coexist and cohabit the same space. So that metaphor I took and I ran with it completely and created this sort of bar-like 2020 sort of environment where they all hang out and drink like craft beer and talk about like what happened on Instagram yesterday. But all this is just to set the scene, and as you can see, images of the installation rolling in the background. I already did last Friday an Instagram live run through with Charlottenborg because I'm one of the, I think I'm the only artist from the show who actually lives here in Copenhagen. So I was able to go there and do like a live presentation of each of the figures. So I won't go into the specific characters and their traits because you can go watch the other video, but I'll speak more about the commission process and the sort of research that led up to it. So when I got the invitation from Jeppe and Alison, it made a lot of sense, even though I hadn't previously worked explicitly with the figure of the witch, but I had already sort of shown a lot of interest in especially sort of Danish folk traditions and using it in contemporary art to sort of express something a little more, almost like a collective cultural subconscious. Just like Jeppe also spoke about the potential of folklore to be folklore or folk traditions to express something that is not really easily said in words. And prompted by the invitation, I started doing a lot of research into the figure of the witch and especially in the Nordic in my cultural understanding as a person who grew up in Denmark. Her Nordic traits also. And it ended up sort of landing in 3 piles, sort of a direction that was very interested in, that was very attuned to sort of the Old Norse traditions, based on sort of these like prehistoric myths, skaldic traditions that were written down in like in the medieval ages. Then the second column was more or less like folklore as a full body, but especially the folklore that was collected and scientifically gathered in the late 1800s, which was which in Denmark especially is a very sort of special, has a very special history. And then the third one was sort of this idea of these stretchy categories of mythology in which, for instance, figures like trolls or giants or the witch were extremely, there's an extreme generosity with what it can mean and represent. And in different times, people do different things with these categories. And I was interested in all these 3 things that are seemingly very different. And having a meeting and chatting with Jeppe and Alison, I was sort of confused about which direction to go in. And I just remember, Alison and Jeppe just saying like, why not just all of it? And so I ended up sort of concocting this like little stew with everything combined, and it ended up in this realm that more or less like, if you know about the Avengers movie franchise, in which superheroes from sort of different storylines and different timelines, and people that superheroes that might have sort of contradictory roles end up coexisting in a universe, even though it doesn't really make sense. It ends up making sense somehow otherwise. And that was more or less the it's a post-rationalization, of course, but that was more or less the vibe that I was going for with this. Yes. But so I want to dive into these 3 columns of the research, which resulted into these 41 specific figures. The first one, as I said, are the sort of the Old Norse traditions, what maybe more people might know under sort of the name of Norse mythology or Nordic mythology. And in that, there is especially a very big resonance between the witch and the völve. It's either called, in Swedish it's like vulva, and in Danish it's völven, or in English sometimes she's even called the voluspa, because she is the seeress who is telling Odin, one of the main gods, an entire long poem about how the world is gonna end. Maybe some people know Ragnarok. That is sort of foretold by the seeress. But she is already in this story. She is resurrected from the dead, so she actually belongs to like a kind of prehistory. She's even older than the Norse traditions, and she's part of a Old Norse tradition of creating sight. I don't know how to say that in English. It's just like the word magic doesn't really necessarily mean anything except what is sort of attributed to it. I guess that you could say that about every word, but just like magic can mean very different things in different contexts, the word sight in Old Norse context meant very different things depending on what scholars you look into. But in Old Norse, it was called like seidr, and represented this idea of like counter-natural magic, more or less. It could either be something that was like embarrassing or difficult for the normal society to contain, or it could be a sort of, or it could be something you needed to do if all else failed, much like you would see later with the figure of the witch, that you would go to her if everything sort of went wrong. But so you see how there's a big relation between the Voluspa and the witch later, even though they're like almost 1,000 years apart. In the Old Norse traditions, there's also this idea of an other in the Jotun, the giants, that they sort of like lived in a different land, and they were sort of the opposites, that had a different kind of magic that was also sort of evil, but they could somehow be helpful once in a while. Like you could need their magic, even though because they could solve issues that the Aesir couldn't, or things like this. And furthermore, there was also the class of the Vanir, which again belongs to a sort of prehistory. So within the stories of Norse mythology, this is a prehistory. They're telling it as if like in even older times than theirs, these things happened. A war between the Vanir and the Aesir, two classes of gods. And the Vanir had a different kind of magic, which again rings a lot of bells with like animistic traditions and cider and witches and witchcraft. The second column, the folkloric part, as I said, refers to this. I dove into a lot of Danish folkloric research. For instance, this is just one out of 6 tomes of like enormous collections of folkloric tales that span anywhere between 1 paragraph and 10 or 100 of small little stories that can go anything from like once down the road there was a little troll, the end, to sort of entire narratives with many characters and sort of Greek tragedy proportions. But because Denmark is a very small country, it was actually a probable and possible job for a researcher to collect more or less everything and be a little encyclopedic about folklore in Denmark. So for instance, people like Axel Olrik and Evil Tang Christensen went all around Denmark and literally talked to everybody that they could get their hands on. Everybody, especially old people and especially old women, would have these tales. Again, that folklore, just like the Norse traditions and Skaldic tradition in general, has this like prehistoric air about it. It's almost like people often telling about how it used to be, or in olden times it was so and so. So it's very rare that people say like, I know that there is a witch out here, but people say like, there used to be a witch, or when I was a child there was a witch, or so there's this idea of like a bygone era of folkloric figures. But one thing that's also extremely interesting in the folkloric sort of column is that there's a big tension between super hyper local stories where there's one person or one character living in one specific place doing a very specific thing at a very specific time in history, and then these more general ideas and stories that are more that are almost like fairy tales, where it's like once there was a dragon and it did so and so and so. So there's a big sort of there's a big span between the two sort of ends of what folklore can be. It can either be testimony almost, or it can be this painterly abstract metaphor of a story. And lastly, I talked about this third column of these sort of elastic categories. And in that, it was also very interesting to me to think about the fact that in Danish, the word hex is actually a pretty rare, a pretty late invention. Hex means witch in Danish now. And also the English word hex means like curse or something like that. And this word actually only entered Danish around the time of Malleus Maleficarum, that maybe some people know is this like the beginning of the witch trials. And before that, the only word that was associated with women that created magic in this way that we would now call a witch was what we in Danish call trolldom, as a trolldom. So it is with the domain of the troll. So you see how, in fact, and you would call like a magic woman or a magic man, you would call a trollkvinde or trollmand, that they would be basically trolls or related to trolls. And that's again like, what is a witch? Is she a troll person, or is it a separate figure? Or and how are trolls? What is a troll even? Is it an animistic rendition of nature, or is it a being? Is it a class of a near human specimen, or what is it? So all these like weird sort of elastic categories, just like the witch. Once you dive into them and especially look at their etymology, you really you realize that you're just pulling at a thread and the whole sweater falls apart, because it's all sort of, everything is interwoven, everything is codependent, you define a witch by not being a troll, basically, or something like that. There's a weird sort of codependency within these buildings of folkloric and mythological sense, world building, as maybe Federico Campagna would say, worlding. But that's also where I found a lot of figures that belong to the same sort of class as the witch, like the trolls, as I said, or the elves, or the elder people, but also giants and dwarves and gnomes, all these figures that a lot of people might recognize from sort of late 1800s folkloric imagination, but also such things as like mermaids or mer people that have been around and are basically a kind of global phenomenon in a weird way. A lot of different cultures have different sort of rendition of this like half person, half fish. And so it was just really interesting to see how these, when you started the research, to see how elastic these categories were actually. But these three columns that I was researching all ended up sort of conjoining into this idea of a circle of friends for the witch, or a circle of kin that she could sort of relate to or be in the same room as. I imagine that they all sort of more or less peripherally know of each other, or that they must at least know more of each other than we do. So having them in this like social setting of the sort of bar-like setup where, you know, there's a group over here chatting and they might sort of, you know of those people over there, but not really know everything about them. And that's exactly how I saw it, as this like this network of mythos and pathos sort of interwoven. And I tried to give each of the characters sort of more or less inspired by improvisational theater. I tried to give them all a sort of +1 or like a yes and, whereas like each of them are representing research I did as like based on folklore or Norse mythology, but they're also maybe one is sad, or maybe one is a smoker, or maybe one is you know, I try to give them an additional trait to sort of also humanize them even more and have an undercurrent of character building, to sort of add, to also try and add to these stories that basically live when they're retold. They don't, I mean, they're great to read, but they're even better when they're told, because then you forget certain things and you add other things that you think suited better, and then the next person sort of reiterates something else. So yeah, each of the figures more or less became these animistic renditions of a piece of nature. And that was, of course, all based on foraged materials I found in Denmark also, which metaphorically related to them sort of springing out of the ground as these mythological creatures in line with the witch. Yeah, I see you popped in with the camera, so I should probably finish.
I don't want to interrupt you, but thank you, Rasmus. A very generous and general overview to this very, very multi-layered project. We're so in awe. I think all of us have been in awe of how far you went with this project, both materially and sort of etymologically, actually. I want to also ask you a little bit more about the kind of the materialization of these, because one thing that you don't mention is, of course, Sankt Hanshexen. And I don't know how important, or how, if that became sort of less and less important as the project moved on, or as the project developed, but certainly one of our first conversations was this sort of you know, reflection on the only place that the witch really pops up in Danish culture today. Sort of, you know, Hollywood aside, Hermione aside, is the midsummer tradition of kind of making, of fashioning a witch out of natural material, putting clothes on her, and then burning her on a stake, like quite literally.
So that basically that schematic, that sort of basic, I guess I would refer to it as a sculptural logic, that way of creating the witch, which is, as you say, like you take some clothes, you fill it with straw, and then you put it on top of this bonfire and light it on fire. It's a horrible misogynistic thing that is still kept around, and it sounds like it's like a twee, like maybe some obscure people in the countryside do it, but it literally is everybody doing it still, and
everyone.
It's so odd to say, like, actually some people were just thrown to jail for doing the exact same thing, but making a doll out of the prime minister, and that was considered completely horrendously like a death threat. Whereas apparently once a year it's totally fine to burn effigies of women. But yeah, so I took that sculptural logic of clothes and a natural material, and in a way I sort of decided that the Sankt Hans witch is made of straw, and that also perfectly represents sort of her the culture that created the witch that we are familiar with, at least from the witch trials, which is this like farmer country that sort of would have that the hay would represent her perfectly as this like as this effigy of a doll, right? Whereas maybe each of these different mythological figures or Norse mythology figures would then represent different kinds of materials and maybe would have a perfect match in something else. So I really tried to create from the bottom like outfits based on the character that I wanted them to exhume, but then also have each material also sort of match perfectly with the character as they were described in sort of mythology and folklore. And as I said, also there's this online, there's this live Instagram live run through where I go through each of them and talk about all this stuff.
I really recommend that that video. It's there's so much story within each character actually, and it's a miracle that you know them all.
They're great stories.
Thank you, Rasmus.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rasmus. Yeah, I mean, just walking through, just thinking about an initial studio visit and going through the like hundreds of pages in that notebook together, and the kind of specificity to the materiality, the posture, the props, and your kind of interventions on these, all of the clothing items that you so carefully kind of chose. There's so much within each figure. So I know that we're at time, and I know that you've done more walkthroughs than any of us. So just really want to thank you for that, and for
thank you for inviting me and the rest of these incredible artists to have the opportunity to talk about these things.
Yes, we echo that, and that probably concludes the day. Thank you so much, everyone who is listening, and for tuning in. Thank you to the artists. Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Charlottenborg, for helping us set up. Thank you, Matthias. And
thank you,
final advertising is probably is that our publication is still out there and is available for purchase. If anyone's interested, please find us or contact the museum or contact Alison or I. And yeah, have a great weekend.
Thank you.